Hi, my name's Sanne Roeven, and this is my poster presentation on compulsory voting and its impacts on incumbent re-election. Um, I I worked on this project last semester for one of my political science classes, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was really interesting to look into compulsory voting, which I had only found out about recently. I thought it was really interesting that some countries use compulsory voting, and I was curious what impact that had on election results. So it's important because all around the world, as democracies are faced with declining voter turnout, they're looking for ways to combat that. And one of those solutions is compulsory voting that some countries have adopted. It's important to have a high voter turnout or relatively high because that's what lends legitimacy to governments. Governments that don't receive high voter turnouts can be seen as less legitimate. So for my research, I examined two countries, the Netherlands and Australia, and I looked at election results over six election cycles. And I was curious to see if there was a change, specifically if incumbents tended to be elected more frequently after instituting compulsory voting or under compulsory voting systems than under non-compulsory systems. So some background. There has been a fair amount of research that's gone into the question of if compulsory voting actually does increase voter turnout. And there's also been some research into how it affects electoral outcomes, but the research on its effects on electoral outcomes has focused primarily on ideological outcomes. And there are some hypotheses suggesting that the ideological left would have an advantage in compulsory voting systems. But what seems to come out more is that it just increases the uninformed vote, and that makes elections more unpredictable as uninformed voters are unpredictable. So it muddles the vote. There has also been some research on if it increases female representation, but those findings were inconclusive. There has not been research, or at least I have not found any research on if there is an impact on incumbent re-election, however. And this would be valuable because governments choose to adopt these compulsory voting regulations to increase their legitimacy. But if compulsory voting helps incumbent parties to win again, then that could call into question the motives and the legitimacy of the policy. Currently, there are 21 countries that use compulsory voting and 4 that use compulsory voting only for certain people, like certain elections, certain types of elections. And although that is small compared to the total number of countries in the world, it can definitely be valuable examples to look at when countries are considering instituting this policy. So for my research, like I said, I used Australia and the Netherlands as samples, and Australia instituted federal compulsory voting in 1984, and the Netherlands had instituted it previously, but repealed it in 1970. So to measure if there was a significant difference between the percent of votes captured by the incumbent party in compulsory voting or versus non-compulsory voting, I took the results of the 3 elections before the change and after the change. And so that means that if you look at figure 2, you can see on the on the left hand side that those are leading up to the change. So in Australia, it's chronological. So it's going from before there was a change. So on the left-hand side, left-hand half of that graph, they do not have compulsory voting. And then on the right-hand half of that half of the graph, they do have compulsory voting. And for the Netherlands, it's just flipped because they match Australia in not having compulsory voting for the negative numbers and having compulsory voting for the positive numbers. On the right-hand half of that graph that says years, that is just chronological for you to be able to see it just chronologically for reference. So I conducted a difference of means test, and for my purpose, I defined incumbency as the party that received the most seats in the previous election. This was because both Australia and the Netherlands have parliaments, and they often don't get majorities, and so they have to form either they rule with a minority or they form a coalition government. And so I defined incumbency as the party that had the most seats in the previous election. And so my results for both of the countries combined was not significant. I had a p-value of 0.157. And so it wasn't terribly high, but it also wasn't low enough to be considered significant. However, my results from just Australia were significant at a 0.1 level with a p-value of 0.079. So, I mean, it's not super, it is significant at that level. It's not very strict, but this would indicate that more research should be done in looking into it. My own samples were really small. I just used 6 elections from each country. And so I think that looking at a larger sample in the future, considering more elections before and more elections after, and also considering other countries would be really valuable for this research and give it a broader depth. Also, using a bivariate research design, my results can't be used to definitively conclude causality. But if it does suggest that a multivariate analysis should be done on this subject, especially because it is an important subject as more countries are considering this as an option. Thank you for looking at my poster and listening to my presentation. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I believe that there's a comments or questions section below, so please write your questions and I will do my best to answer them. Thank you so much.